So, hello everyone. Welcome to the third seminar in the seminar series, Sociology of Teaching and Learning, Bridging the Two Islands of JERA, Faculty of Education, the University of Hong Kong. Today, we have the absolute pleasure of having Professor Paul Ashwin join us in the seminar series, talking to us about knowledge, a very, very important and perhaps the least considered object of teaching and learning in higher education. I'm just going to give a brief introduction of Paul, and then we're going to kick off the seminar. Before doing that, let me just very briefly remind you how this works. So this is the third seminar in the series, and how the series works is that we're going to have a relatively brief presentation at first, and the rest of the time is devoted for questions, dialogues, conversations. So this series is really all about those dialogues that follow up the presentation as well. I particularly encourage our students from HKU to take part in the conversation. Alrighty, so without further ado, let me introduce our speaker today. Professor Paul Ashwin is a professor of higher education, Department of Educational Research, Lancaster University. He's deputy director of the Center for Global Higher Education and leads the center's Graduate Experiences of Employability and Knowledge project, which is examining the experiences of graduates of chemistry and chemical engineering in England, South Africa, and the United States. His book, Transforming University Education, a Manifesto from 2020, argues for a focus on the educational rather than economic purposes of university degrees in order to understand their transformational impact on students and societies. He's also the lead author on Reflective Teaching in Higher Education, a book written by an international team to support the development of research-informed university teaching. All right, the stage is yours.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Let me just share my slides and check that works. Okay, can you see that? Yeah, great. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about knowledge. It's lovely to see so many people here, some of whom I know. And the first thing I should say before I kick off is that when I say that it's the least considered object of teaching and learning in higher education, I'm really saying that in relation to the kind of mainstream research on learning and teaching in higher education. There is plenty of research on knowledge in universities, knowledge in educational forms, but it doesn't really enter the mainstream. So if I come across as some kind of megalomaniac as I go on about how I've talked about this, that's not really intended. I'm giving my version of this, but there's plenty of other versions of this kind of knowledge debate you can find. Lisa Wheeler and Gavin, who I can see Gavin Moody, who I can see are here, have done work on it. People like Joe Muller in South Africa, Carl Mayton's work with colleagues around legitimation code theory. There's plenty of stuff that takes knowledge and thinks about its place, but it doesn't really enter the mainstream of research on teaching and learning higher education. So that's what I'm talking about. You've got my email address, my Twitter handle. I refuse to call it X as I'm not a 14-year-old boy. And if you want to get in contact and tell me why I'm wrong or continue the conversation, then you're most welcome to. So to put this into some kind of context, where my work has kind of headed towards is this question of what are we trying to achieve educationally with the degree programs that we offer students? And really this question about what does it mean to offer students an education? What does it mean within higher education to say to students, come and study with us? We feel we've got knowledge that can do important things in your lives and enable you to do exciting things. What is that relationship? What is that process? And this came from a kind of personal trajectory where my PhD, I was working full-time in further education. So that's kind of within the UK context is kind of like a general college that has pre-higher education qualifications, vocational qualifications, educating people really from probably age 14 to age 90. And I was working in a big further education college in East London, and I was setting up peer learning schemes where students support each other in that college. And at that time, and that turned into my PhD. And at that time, for me, it was all about learning. Learning was everything. And then as I continued some work and I kind of moved to look at students' experiences in higher education, I suddenly had this amazing insight that maybe teaching was quite important too. So my kind of work shifted to think about learning and teaching. And then when I was doing that work, I kept on hearing this word curriculum, and I kind of didn't really make any sense to me. Didn't really know what it was. Kind of ignored it for as long as I could. And then I had a moment where actually the way in which knowledge is transformed into curricula, the ideas of particularly Basil Bernstein, that the logic of a curriculum is not the same as the logic of research, because when you produce a curriculum, it's transformed through power relations and actually becomes something different. That for me became a really powerful idea that still plays a key role in my thinking. And then from that, where I've got to recently is kind of almost something that brings all those elements together for me, which is what does it mean to educate students in higher education? That's an idea to try and situate you in terms of where I'm coming from. And what I'm going to talk through, hopefully quickly. I'm always worried when people say there'll be a brief presentation, and people go on for far too long when it's supposed to be brief. I'll do my best not to. But I want to say something about how I see the educational purposes of higher education, and then 3 quick bits on my argument, well, and also lots of other people's arguments I've already said about why knowledge matters, an idea of why knowledge actually gets ignored within these debates, and then something on the consequences of ignoring knowledge. So let's not do it with the rolling mouse. Let's do it with that. There's a bit of a delay on it, which is confusing me. There we go. Okay, stay. Okay, so this is a kind of pretty unoriginal diagram that was in the book, Transforming University Education, but it looks like lots of things that are 3. It looks like the kind of thing Vygotsky would use, like sort of thing that's in activity theory. There's lots of people who do things with 3. Gert Easter does subjectification, socialization, and certification. So there's lots of 3s. Here's one 3 that I kind of find helpful, and it's the idea of what we're trying to do in higher education is we're trying to bring students in a powerful relation to structured and collective bodies of knowledge that they can use to engage with and interpret the world. It's really important that these aren't gobbets of knowledge. These aren't generic skills. These are bodies of knowledge that have a history and a structure and have been produced by many women and men over many, many decades and centuries. And it's that structure that allows students to engage in particular ways. Clearly, that's not everything that students get from their university experiences. So there's also an arrow directly between students and the world for other experiences. But this, for me, is what we're trying to do in higher education. We're trying to say to students, here's some knowledge that you can use to think about and engage the world. And to try and give you an example of that, here's a quote from a project that I did quite a few years ago with Monica McLean and Andrew Abbas, with a student we gave the pseudonym Esther to. And Esther says, there's no destination with this discipline. There's always something further. And there is no point where you can stop and say, I understood, I'm a sociologist. The thing is, sociology makes you aware of every decision you make, how that would impact on my life and how it can impact on someone else. And it makes the decision harder to make. And what I love about this quote from Esther is there's a sense that she's engaging and seeing the world differently, but there's also a sense of education being about loss as well as gain, about the world becoming more complicated and more difficult as you know more about it. And often around this time, when I kind of talk in these terms and about this being related to the role of education in transforming students' perspectives, quite often people say, yeah, Paul, that's sociology. Sociology is a bit odd. That's what we'd expect sociology to do. So that informed the project that is just coming to an end now, where we've tracked students through chemistry and chemical engineering degrees. We tracked them for 7 years in the end. First of all, through their undergraduate degrees, and then for a few years after graduation, and interviewed them each year about various things, including how they saw knowledge. So this is a quotation from that project with the student we gave the student named Donna to. And she was a chemistry student at this stage, and she says, I'll observe something which someone who doesn't do chemistry, they'll just see it for what it is. But then in my mind, I just start thinking about the theory behind why that's working. sometimes the science element kind of goes off in my brain and I start analysing things in that kind of way. Because I mean, science, it's great to know, but it's not purely for the benefit of knowledge. We want to know, but then we want to see how we can use that knowledge and how we can apply it and improve things. So for me, the way I interpret this quotation and the wider context of Donna's second year interview is definitely a sense of chemistry knowledge changing how they see the world, the science bit going off in their brain. But the other reason I selected and like this quote from Donna is because it kind of cuts across, understanding as application, but learning as application versus learning as understanding. She wants to apply and she wants to understand. I like the way it cuts across those kind of categories. So there's kind of two qualitative versions of that. Then this table, which you probably can't see the bottom of, but just kind of summarizes a number of studies that have kind of looked at the ways in which students understand particular disciplines. So in accountancy, moving from seeing accountancy as routine work to what I've called their watershed account, the account we'd want students to at least get to by the end of an undergraduate degree. So in terms of accountancy, seeing it as meaningful work, to a most inclusive way of understanding accountancy, seeing it as moral work. And then kind of you've got different really courses there. Disciplines is wrong, as someone pointed out to me in a seminar the other day. It's really different courses students were studying, but whilst the structures are different, and it's important that they're different, and I'll come on and say some more about this, what we have is a kind of, for each area, a kind of common sense way of seeing that subject, to a way that's structured, to a way that goes beyond that structure. So in John Biggs's term within the solo taxonomy, you might call that a kind of extended abstract way of thinking. And as I've said, there's an engagement with structured bodies of knowledge, but that's different in these different subject areas. And that's really key for the argument that I want to make. So coming on to my three questions. So the first question of why does knowledge matter? As I hope is kind of clear by now, I would argue that knowledge is key to the educational purposes of higher education. It's what higher education's for. Higher education degrees are about introducing students to structured bodies of knowledge. The way I'm kind of playing around with this at the moment is kind of said in two ways in that second bullet point. First of all, it's a kind of getting access to know how knowledge claims are made and validated in particular disciplines, fields of knowledge. I kind of quite like this because you could say a kind of undergraduate taught postgraduate level, you're learning how these things are made and validated. And then when you do a PhD, you're actually making a knowledge claim yourself. So, there's something there that I'm kind of interested in playing around with it. Another way I'm kind of playing around with talking about that is that it's about seeing knowledge. It's about seeing bodies of knowledge from the inside and using them to engage with the world. So you might say, and I don't know about this, I don't know whether it's wrong about schooling, but one thing I'm playing around with is the idea that within school, what you're doing is you're seeing knowledge from the outside. You're being introduced to many different subjects from the outside. And then what you do when you move to higher education, and what makes it higher, is that you move to see the world really through that knowledge. So you're seeing that knowledge from the inside. And so the transformational nature of higher education lies in the way that students relate their identity to these bodies of knowledge, and they have particular bodies of knowledge that they're studying, which change how they see themselves and how they see the world. And what this does, and I think this applies to all education, is that it also highlights that education is always a local achievement. It's always about particular students engaging with particular bodies of knowledge in a particular setting. And if one of those things changes, then an effective way of educating will change, which is why that the history of educational innovations shows, or it's one of the reasons why, that if you look at educational innovations, their history is initial group of enthusiasts who think it's brilliant, then it tries to spread further, and then it ceases to be effective and kind of gets domesticated in various ways. And for me, that's related this idea of the local achievement, which means that educators always has to think about how it works for the knowledge they're offering students access to, for the students they're seeking to educate, and for the setting in which they're located. So that's my version of why knowledge matters. And I've said there's plenty of other people who've got versions of that. So why is it ignored? Given I'm saying, well, it's absolutely central to the educational process, why is it that kind of mainstream teaching and learning research in higher education generally ignores it? And I've kind of got 4 goes of this that I think play a role. And when we move to the discussion, I'll be interested to hear whether you've got other versions or you disagree with some of these. So the first one, I think, is institutional in the sense that the idea of the institutional form of the university completely dominates the way we think about higher education in a really unhelpful way. You know, so whether it's university rankings, you know, which we know are nonsense, but they're particularly nonsense at the level of an institution. I mean, you know, they might be kind of useful at a particular subject level, telling you about a particular degree, but telling you about a university, they're absolute nonsense. But universities kind of put them all over their buildings and go on about them in a fairly embarrassing way. And for me, that's related to the dominance of this idea of the university. And so because we're thinking about the university, we're thinking about lots and lots of disciplines and professional areas and subjects all at the same time, which means that the knowledge disappears. And we talk about it in generic terms as if these things are the same. But in terms of education, they're really importantly different. Another reason is that there's an awful lot of kind of what I've called here objectless foci in research. So people talk about learning without talking about the learning of what by whom. They talk about student engagement without talking about student engagement with what. They talk about the student experience without talking about the student experience of what. You know, and it's kind of, I mean, so I wrote a chapter with Debbie McVitie on student engagement where we talked about different objects of student engagement. So it could be student engagement with knowledge, could be student engagement with the course, could be student engagement with their institution, and the engagement, you know, what that relationship is, because all of those things, all they signify is a relationship. You know, learning is a relationship, engagement is a relationship, experience is a relationship. Unless you say what the relationship is between, you haven't said anything meaningful. But it is quite remarkable when you look at the student engagement literature with that lens, how there's whole models and publications built around student engagement without ever saying what students are engaging with. So there's a conceptual reason why knowledge disappears, because we don't talk about the object of student engagement. Then methodologically, lots of studies, particular kind of survey-based studies, have students from lots of different disciplines. So again, the knowledge disappears because you're talking, you know, you're getting biology students and chemistry students and management students and architecture students all to fill in the same questionnaire. So how would it tell you anything about knowledge? I have to say, having now been involved in 2 longitudinal qualitative projects, one for three years and one for seven years, I am kind of increasingly skeptical that students filling in surveys about their learning experience can tell us anything beyond a kind of fairly blunt idea of whether that was a useful experience for them or not. The idea that these surveys can tell us something fine-grained and nuanced about different kinds of experiences, I'm extremely skeptical about. And part of the reason, I'll probably come on and say a bit more about that, is that the paper I'm working on at the moment, we in 2 different parts of the interviews over 7 years, we asked students what they were gaining from studying chemistry and chemical engineering. And then in a different part of the interview, we asked them what they were gaining from being at university. And those 2 answers are completely different. And they're different for all students, but by and large, if you ask them about what they're gaining about learning about a particular subject, you get a knowledge-rich, engaged answer about what their education is giving them. If you ask them what they're gaining from studying at university, you get a very consumer-focused version of being at university. And actually, where I'm ending up in thinking about those things is that actually student as consumer versus learning as transformation, or whether students are instrumental or they're deeply engaged, it's just about the register that they're talking about their education. It's not about different types of students. It's about a different way of talking about education. And as I'll come on and say, that's what makes the shift to much more generic ways of talking about education so dangerous. Because, and Gert Baister would say this, he'd say that education is incredibly weak, and the only way you can make education strong is by taking all the complexity out. And once you take all of that complexity out, then it ceases to be education. So there's a real danger in that way of thinking. And then the final point there is the practical thing, is that if you're a policymaker, and you're trying to work out what to do in your higher education system, obviously you can't cope with all of those different disciplines all of the time. So from their perspective, knowledge doesn't matter. And that is completely acceptable because they're, well, it's inevitable. That's what they're doing. But part of our job as people committed to and engaged in higher education is to go, actually, your graduate outcomes, if you're a chemist, are not the same as your graduate outcome if you're studying literature. And to try and pretend they're the same is actually a misunderstanding of what higher education does. So if we come on to the consequences, and then we'll open it up for discussion. For me, there are kind of really important consequences. So first of all, as I've already said, is that sense that if you ignore knowledge, you lose a sense that studying different bodies of knowledge leads to different outcomes for students. So you end up talking about graduate outcomes as we do in England, and they do in Australia, and they do in a lot of countries, and certainly the OECD and the European Commission are very keen on talking about generic graduate outcomes, as if that's a meaningful way of talking about what students have got from their engagement with bodies of knowledge. It's kind of, really worrying that these generic ways of talking about benefits are really dominating, and the fact that universities are so keen to talk about education in that way. It's understandable why other people might do that, but actually for universities whose role is to be stewards of knowledge for society, for them to play this game of talking about generic outcomes is a betrayal of their role, in my view. David Watson, in his book The Question of Conscience, develops the idea of a university oath that has various aspects to it. And one of the aspects of that oath, he says, look after your treasure, and the treasure of universities is the knowledge that we produce, the ways in which we give students and local communities access to that knowledge to transform their lives. And if we engage in these ways of talking about education that ignore knowledge, then we're not looking after our treasure, and we're not fulfilling our role as stewards for society. Then the other thing it does, if we ignore knowledge, is that we kind of think that improving education is easy. Educating anyone is incredibly difficult. It's an incredibly hard thing. But when we take the knowledge out, it looks incredibly obvious. We can talk nonsense about best practice and what works, as if there's a single way of educating. As I said before, effective education is always local. It's always thinking about, well, we've got these students and we're trying to get them to develop this kind of understanding in this setting. What is it that we need to design? And that's the other reason why the history of educational innovations is one of initial success followed by general failure, is that when you look at the initial success, what those people are trying to do is to solve an educational problem. They're saying, well, why doesn't this work in this context? What's going on here? Whereas the later people aren't trying to solve an education problem. They're trying to follow best practice. They're trying to follow the steps. They're trying to be pure in the way that these innovations are applied. And this is just nonsense. that doesn't help you to think about developing a good education. What helps you to think about that, and what should inform our curriculum development, is thinking about, well, given these students and given we want to develop this kind of understanding, what's the series of experiences that we want to support. Then the third point, as I've already said, is that it supports policymakers to position the purposes of higher education in terms of generic graduate outcomes. You know, in England, this has got to the depressing stage of it being about salary, as if, you know, the salaries that students or graduates end up earning are somehow in the control of universities. You know, I mean, it's a basic principle of measurement that you should only measure people in relation to things they have control over. But we've ended up in this idea of graduate outcomes that somehow universities are responsible for whatever people do in their lives, which obviously puts particularly Oxford in a very difficult position, given the series of prime ministers we've had who they educated and have done various things to crash our country. So there's that kind of thing. As I've said, it undermines the educational purposes of higher education if we forget about knowledge. But crucially, we end up in a position where if higher education isn't about the deep engagement with knowledge, if higher education is about developing graduate attributes, then why would you do 3 years of intense study on a campus? If you're looking to do generic skills, you can do that with a micro-credential online very, very cheaply. You know, so when I talk about universities not looking after this treasure, in, you know, kind of when universities meet these discourses, what their response tends to be is, yeah, we can do that if you give us the money. If you give us the money, what's the funding? We'll do that. But they don't realise that actually they're undermining what higher education is for. And in the end, if that's what it's about, then there's far cheaper ways of doing it. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that everyone be educated in that way. No. Be much more pernicious than that. What you'll get is the few privileged people with access to higher education, as it's widely thought about in the idea of the university, and then poor people getting access to a watered down version of higher education and being told how lucky they are to get it. So to me, there's a real responsibility for universities, for university leaders, but also for academics to really be clear about the role that knowledge plays and how students having a sustained engagement with knowledge is absolutely key to what higher education can do. And as I've said, there's a side of me that really worries that when you talk about education in particular terms, so I gave the example earlier of if you ask students what they gain from going to university and you ask them what they gain from studying particular knowledge, you get very different answers, one which is in a kind of consumer register and the other one which is in a very knowledge-rich register. So if we end up in a policy discourse where higher education is presented in very instrumental terms, then actually everything will become more instrumental, because that will be the register that people expect to engage with in higher education. The only thing that makes me hopeful is that that kind of oversimplified, weak version of education can't possibly contain what education can actually do, can't possibly contain the power of knowledge and what knowledge can offer people. So in a way, it will never become completely dominant because you know, there's something about the richness of knowledge. But for universities to talk so carelessly about knowledge in the way that they do, I think is deeply problematic, and something, you know, that they should, you know, university leaders who pretend rankings say something that they don't say, who tell governments they can do generic skills without actually saying, well, we do something different, really should be considering what damage they're doing to the long-term health of higher education. And on that slight depression note, I'll stop sharing and we'll open up for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Prof, for an absolutely exciting talk. Let me just note, I've received a couple of questions. So the session is recorded, and everyone who has registered will get a link to their email to the recording later on. So everyone, please, we now have around half an hour for all sorts of questions, comments, conversations. So if you have any kind of an idea that is not exactly a question, this would be a wonderful time for that. And we do have a first contribution here in the chat by Gavin Moody. You might want to elaborate on your question. Let me just read it out loud. So, Paul, might knowledge also be ignored for teleological reasons because of the hegemony of a reductive form of human capital theory?
Gavin, do you want to say a bit more about that, or?
Oh no, it's a question. It's your seminar.
Yeah. And in a way, I think part of so within kind of for a while I studied metaphysics and epistemology for various reasons in a appalling master's degree I did. But there's a notion there of under a description. I think it's Dominic Davidson kind of gives the example of why are weather reports so commonly inaccurate. And they're so commonly inaccurate is that the language in which a weather report actually makes sense is then translated under a description into a weather report that is much less accurate and meaningful than the original language. And that idea I find really helpful. So when I'm talking about that you can talk about education in consumerist terms, and if you talk to students in ways that signal that, they'll give you that answer. And if you talk about it in a way that signals knowledge, they'll give you that answer. And that's why we have to be so careful. And in a way, I would completely agree with what you've got there, Gavin, about those reasons. The question for me is, what are other ways of describing the same reasons, and what are new reasons? So I agree that that's a reason, but actually it might be take parts of some of the other reasons I've offered, or might be a reason in its own right. And that is something that on the spot I would struggle to answer, I think. But yeah, I think what I try and do when I'm working with this is try and think about what work can we do to make it other than it is, and the way I've framed it is framed because I want to be hopeful, and I think a Marxist way of framing it makes it more difficult for me to see the hope. I know for other people it doesn't, but for me it does. But yeah, so that's a waffly non-answer to your succinct question.
Well, one alternative perhaps is the capabilities approach, where people conceive of what they want to be able to do in their own terms, which might be vocationally oriented for some purposes, and it might be participatory political purposes as well.
Yeah. No, I think the capabilities approach and the works that have been done there, particularly in South Africa with the work Melanie Walker and colleagues have done at University of Free State. There's really fascinating things there about ways of thinking differently about the ways in which political commitments come together with knowledge to produce a particular kind of graduate.
Wonderful. I take that as a end of that conversation. There's an absolutely fascinating question in the chat by Natalie Fortis, but it's a bit long. Natalie, do you want to ask it for yourself, or do you want me to read it?
Hi, sorry, I'm having trouble with my phone. If you could please use so, that would be great.
No worries. So the question goes, I wonder how much of the marginalization of knowledge is down to Bloom's taxonomy, and knowledge being naively condensed to understanding, hence a move towards skills that obfuscates knowledge plus Plus, the move away from exams has again naively reinforced the move away from basic knowledge to a focus on authentic assessment that gets simplified to developing skills, maybe.
Yeah. Again, I think that that's another way of describing the arguments I'm making. I have to say I'm not a huge fan of Bloom's taxonomy. So, I should say that as someone who doesn't know a great deal about it. But it's a way of dealing with knowledge that's never particularly grabbed me, and kind of almost seems to oversimplify for me in an unhelpful way. So certainly the way you've described it there, Natalie, I can see how that works, and in a way, yeah, that's kind of, yeah, if I think about what's the point of me going on about knowledge in this seminar, I think for me it's about to encourage people to think about what work they can do with knowledge, and if that's something that works for you and offers you powerful way to ask questions, then go and do it, because that's what we need in research. Far too much critique in higher education research, probably in the social sciences generally, is you've used the wrong theory, my theory is better than yours. And actually, we need as many ways of understanding these phenomena as we can. We can never capture their complexity. The world, the complexity of the world exceeds our capacity to know it. So we have to simplify it in some way to make sense of it. And so what we need are lots of different ways of simplifying, so that we can think about, okay, in this context, which kind of simplification helps me to make sense of what's going on. And so it's not about whose simplification is right. In the end, they're all wrong, and they're all kind of right. That's, my view of research is, and life in general, is that in the end, we're all wrong, we're all dead, and we're all forgotten. So we might as well do the thing we think is really important, because no one's going to remember anyway. So, we might as well go for it and, just accept that wrongness is inevitable. So for me, that's not something that speaks to me in the way I understand knowledge, but I can see how it relates to what I've said. And if that's something that you or others find useful, then brilliant, because that's what we need. We need, the power that there's a kind of, I'm kind of going off. Anyway, there's a kind of debate around equality, diversity, and inclusion, in the UK and elsewhere, that's suffering a bit of a backlash from the right at the moment. And the idea is that, EDI is a good thing, and that's why we should have equality, diversity, and inclusion. And to me, again, I don't think that's a helpful way of thinking about it. For me, the reason we want diversity is that we make better decisions. Things are better the more diversity we have. And the same in research. The more ways we have of thinking about a particular phenomena, the more ways we have of playing around with knowledge, the stronger the research is for everyone. And so for me, this isn't, so sometimes I do these presentations and people say, oh, so what do you want people to do with your theory of higher education? I haven't got a theory. I'm drawing on lots of other people's ideas. And what I want people to do is to follow their own ideas to where they take them, and to, there's that sense of being disciplined by knowledge and following the knowledge where it takes you, rather than somehow, well, yeah. So that's another non-answer. So I've got 0 out of 2. Excellent. Who wants to not have their question answered next?
Any responses, anyone? Absolutely fine to continue the dialogue as well, if you feel like that. If not,
I think I was just wondering if you see kind of knowledge and skills being set up as a false dichotomy, because in Wales there's a lot of criticism against kind of the national curriculum for Wales, that it's moved away from knowledge to skills. And I wonder, how can we actually reinforce the role of knowledge within this skills focus?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, and this is part of what I don't do, is I don't say what I mean by knowledge, so I leave it open and vague. And I could mean what Michael Gove means by knowledge. I could mean what I think I actually mean, which is a richer sense of a collective body of knowledge that includes skills. The problem with skills isn't skills themselves. There clearly are skillful performances. The problem with skills is when you take the knowledge out, when you take the knowledge out, they're completely empty and meaningless. Problem solving as a chemist is not the same thing as problem solving as a sociologist. Communicating as a chemist is not the same thing as communicating as a mathematician. Just because we can describe things generically, it doesn't mean they're generic. So for me, and the thing I haven't done, and I feel that given the arguments I'm making, is something I need to think more about, is, well, how do you talk about knowledge-rich versions of skills? And as Gavin mentioned before, the capabilities way of thinking definitely gives one version of doing that, and has some really interesting area. But it's, again, that would be, actually, Natalie, that would be a really smart move for university leaders to make, is to actually come back to policymakers with a knowledge-rich version of skills. Whereas at the moment, my unfair caricature is that their main question is, how much do we get? And then, for good reasons, they need to have sustainable institutions, but actually they also have a role in looking after knowledge.
I can see Natalie's smile, so I assume that you are satisfied with the response.
Thank you.
I'm going to jump to the next question in the chat, and there's a couple of questions lined up in the chat. And we have around 15-ish minutes left. So if you still have any further questions, do post them in the chat, and I'll try to make time for all of them. There's a question by Yun Fang that I'm going to rephrase a bit, because I'm going to ask it in a way that I think I understand this question. So thank you for highlighting the importance of knowledge in higher education. Do you have any actions to promote the implementation of knowledge production in your way? And I'm going to rephrase this a bit. I wonder if you have any thoughts on the idea of knowledge contribution. So this seminar series concerns teaching and learning. So I'm trying to take the conversation a bit more towards what teachers do, what students do.
Yeah.
And I think you mentioned briefly about this continuum that under postgraduate students, they learn kind of the rules of the game, how knowledge works, and then often we assume that PhD students are starting to do some knowledge contributions. So the way I understand this question myself is, do you have any thoughts on this aspect of knowledge contribution already in, say, under and postgraduate studies before PhD studies?
Not immediately, but I'll quickly answer another question, if that's okay, kind of that I think relates to those two things, which is that, to give an example in terms of the actions that Yun has asked for, the classic example I would give is how we think about academic development in universities. So the model of academic development we have is largely about new lecturers doing a course on how to be a teacher. In the way that I'm arguing, and other people, Sue Ellen Shea's work in South Africa is really important in this area. The way I would argue is actually a far better way of doing academic development is to actually get groups of academics in conversations with quality people, with learning technologists, with academic developers, about how to redesign their curriculum and how to implement that curriculum, and to actually focus that development on the thing that matters. And for a few reasons. One, because if you focus on individuals and they leave, then your development's completely wasted. Whereas if you work to produce a curriculum, then that has a sustainability beyond any individual. But also because what it does is it turns that academic development into an intellectual exercise. You're saying to academics who are committed, you would hope, to the knowledge they're giving students access to, how do we make this available for students? Why are our programs designed in the way that they're designed? What would be an effective way of helping students to understand this? And for me, an awful lot, if you want to stop academics thinking, the easiest way to do that is to give them a form to fill in. Then they'll immediately think, what's the quickest way I can fill in this form to go and do the thing I think is important? Whereas if you can engage them in a conversation about why their curricula are designed in the way they are and how that relates to the way students understand knowledge, then you have a completely different conversation. And we had a bit of an example of this in Lancaster. We did some work in the faculty I'm in arts and humanities and social sciences, where we kind of got each degree, undergraduate degree, to say, well, what kind of graduate are you trying to produce here? And for our sociology department, which is a very prestigious department, for them it was about producing public sociologists. For our Institute of Contemporary Arts, it was trying to produce a particular kind of critically reflective practitioner. And so they kind of think about these different kind of graduates and then think about how the design of their program informed. And for me, that's a kind of action that I would implement where you're actually putting that thing at the forefront. The other thing I would say is that if you did that, it would probably work for 3 years and then it would stop working and become bureaucratized, because quickly these things gain an institutional kind of air to them. People will see it as something they have to do and they stop thinking. So you then have to find another angle. And that's always true of kind of academic development work and teaching and learning. Even with the design, of course, you can come up with a design that works brilliantly. Students really understand the knowledge and they're coming out with the outcomes you want, and then it suddenly stops working. That's again, as I've said, education is really hard. And one of the problems we've got at the moment is education is talked about as if any idiot can do it. And actually educating people, designing a program that brings people into a 3-dimensional transformational relationship to knowledge is incredibly, incredibly difficult. Sorry, I said I'd be short and I wasn't. I apologize.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask the next question. And again, I need to do some rephrasing and synthesizing for the lack of time. I want to give as many of you a possibility to ask your questions as possible. There's a question by Chinyu Gua, and it's actually 3 questions, and I'm going to synthesize it down to 1. So in your presentation, you mentioned quite briefly about the insufficiency of, say, surveys in understanding what goes on. So might you have any methodological recommendations for anyone interested in continuing this field of work, doing research on students' engagement with knowledge in higher education? And I know there are many students of mine listening here who might be quite interested in your insights.
Yeah, so I think the first move is to say all of the tools we have are incredibly blunt. So you have to understand that the methodologies we have the accuracies of sledgehammers, not lasers. So and that particularly plays out into kind of quantitative, research where you're turning your data into numbers, quantitative research where people want to use all kind of decimal points and all kind of statistical tests on these things as if they're fine-grained. That they're not fine-grained, and for any data that's true. Interview data, you've asked questions in a particular context, to a particular person in a particular way. Whatever we get is partial. So we have to recognize the partial fragmentary nature of any data we have. So for me, the idea that qualitative and quantitative are different paradigms is just nonsense. They're basically, are you analyzing your data in a textual form or a numerical form? Then what my advice would be is to just be creative and think about, well, given what I'm interested in, what kind of fragments might tell me something useful about that? And think about those fragments. The other thing I would do, and this is probably not possible in the PhD, but we were very lucky within the projects we did to have funding to do it. But when we first started doing longitudinal research in the project I did with Monica McLean and Andrew Abbas, and it was Andrew Abbas who really pushed us to do it longitudinally. I was so skeptical about it. I was like, oh, why would you do it longitudinally? Until kind of, I can remember I did a 2nd-year interview with a student. And in her 1st-year interview, she'd been saying how much she absolutely loved her 1st year and how brilliant it was. And there was no, just absolutely loved it. And then I did her 2nd-year interview with her. And over the course of the interview, she said to me, I was so unhappy last year. I hated it. And I was suddenly like, all right, okay. And just that sense of talking to the same people about their experiences over time just gives you something different. Not necessarily better, but there's something about, for me that really emphasized the bluntness of the data we have. And we have to be really careful how much pressure we put on it. And so I'm not really skeptical about surveys. Surveys can be really useful to show broad patterns, but what tends to happen is far too much weight is put upon them. You know, there are plenty of studies that show that the context in which you ask a question will shape the answer that you get. You know, so but what we choose to do is we choose to forget that. We choose to forget within quantitative research the whole issues of p-hacking and the whole the whole problem of using parametric data tests for data that aren't parametric and can't possibly know whether they're parametric. Stephen Gorard does a really nice article on this in which he says all forms of evidence are flawed, and what our job is to get different forms of evidence that we think might be useful and then make an active interpretation. So there you go. No, that's my version, is nothing specific, but just understand the nature of the task. You're working with fragments and you're building an argument from those fragments. And because, if you're doing a thesis means argument. So there's always a sense that someone could argue against what you're saying. So what you need to do is to take a position and make that argument as clearly as you can. And sometimes PhDs struggle with that because they feel it's arrogant and it's not their place. But what I say is, because it's an argument, built into that is the humility that someone will come back. You've had your thesis, they will offer you the antithesis. But unless you're clear about what your argument is, they can't engage in that conversation with you.
Wonderful. I reckon we still have time for 2 more questions. Let's see. The next question is from Soyoung Lee, and I'm going to squeeze it down from 2 into 1 question. So what Soyoung is asking about is about the role of the concept of student agency within all of this. Let me read it out loud. From my perspective, your findings about students' relationship with knowledge and society is about the development of student agency in a discipline-specific way. So what do you think of this idea of student agency, knowledge as a mediator and society as a structure?
Yeah, I think student agency is really important. In a way, that's not not the part of the argument that I'm focusing on. So my arguments are really trying to get at the educational responsibilities of universities. So I will talk about how universities need to take responsibility for bringing students in a powerful relationship to knowledge. And part of that is knowing who they expect students to become through their engagement with knowledge. In terms of student agency, students can do whatever they want with that knowledge. Students will use that knowledge in ways that the people on their courses, the academics, the teachers have never expected. That's exactly what students should do with it. But that doesn't mean, what can happen with that is that educators can say, oh, well, really, it's not for me to say who students should become. That's something they should do. And I think, well, if you don't think they're going to become anything, if you don't think they're going to do anything with that course, why are you saying to them, come and study with me? So you might not know what they're going to do with it, but you should at least know what you think they could do with it. So I think student agency is really important, but it's again, it's about having lots of people asking aligned different questions. And my focus isn't really on student agency, it's on the educational responsibilities of universities.
Soyoung, might you have anything to add? Are you happy with the answer?
No. Thank you for your response. Yeah.
Lovely to see you.
What can I? Yeah. Thank you.
Alrighty. We have around 5 minutes left, so I'd like to say one more question / dialogue. If there is time for one more, let's see about that. But let me just ask. There's a question by Maria Senias in the chat. Thank you for this fascinating presentation. I might be wrong, but it might be that knowledge is not being marginalized to the same degree in all education systems across the globe. So if you might have any thoughts on that. And Maria is also interested in whether you have looked at the role of lecturers in your research in these questions of knowledge.
Yeah, I think it's certainly not marginalized to the same degree. And hi Maria. Maria used to be a colleague of mine, so lovely to see you, Maria. She used to work at Lancaster. it's not the same way all over the world, but it's so I was in Sweden last week discussing this, and actually people in that audience were split about how much this is relevant to Sweden, how much it isn't. But if you look at, as I said before, if you look at European Commission documents, you look at OEC documents, World Bank documents, even stuff from the UN, you know, so kind of international organizations, the pressure on higher education to be about producing employment is global. That doesn't mean it's everywhere in the same way, you know, and clearly it differentiates and it, you know, and, you know, its meaning changes. But there's, you know, for me, when, you know, so, and in September, I was doing something looking at Egyptian higher education. So I was in Egypt for a week traveling universities there, and you have the same kind of debate. So it's not everywhere in the same way, but that, you know, there's something really beguiling about generic ways of talking about education that seem really attractive to people, seem to offer hope for addressing inequalities. And for me, that makes them even more pernicious.
I think we might have time for one more comment or question. I think Mark Kircher has had a couple of wonderful comments in the chat, so maybe I could ask for one final response to one of Mark's comments. Oh, Mark, would you like to?
Sure. Okay. Thank you, Paul, so much. Really enjoyed your talk, and it's really great to hear from somebody who kind of resonates with some of the thoughts I've been having. So the comments he's referring to there in the chat was just, I think, kind of the fact I feel higher education is becoming really reductive, a focus on kind of smaller and smaller units of competencies and micro-credentials and smaller courses. And I was wondering whether my own perception is that the commodification of education and seeing students as essentially just customers is one, at least, of the drivers of that. Because I'm in Finland in a University of Applied Science, but we seem to be becoming a competency supermarket where a student goes through a degree, puts different competencies into a trolley, checks out, but they never get a big picture on a single body of knowledge. But for me at least, it's that commodification that's a driver. So I'm interested in your view, Paul.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with that, and I would say two things in relation to it that kind of make me feel more hopeful. So first of all, if you look at writings about students since the ancient Greeks, students have always been getting worse. Students always aren't what they used to be. Oh God, they're dreadful. Oh, in my day, they're brilliant. So we have to recognize that that's a pattern, that that's how people feel. It doesn't necessarily mean it's true. And also, as I said earlier, that sense of you know, the power of both knowledge and the power of people's agency, for me, means that will never contain education. You know, yes, it gets talked about in that way, but there'll be people everywhere who are having experiences of education. And certainly I always find this when we research students, is students are doing amazing things with the knowledge. You know, they're really excited about what it can do for them in the world. As I said, if you ask them about what they gain from studying their course, they give you these knowledge-rich answers about how it's given them a way of engaging with the world. So in a way, that power's there. But I think, you know, the urgent danger I feel at the moment is that because, as you said, that consumerist discourse and this generic way of talking about higher education, when we're in the midst of a kind of nature and climate emergency, which will lead to huge financial pressures, is that you can see that mass higher education might become something incredibly pruned down, and you'll just have this huge divide between people who get access to an elite education and people who get access to this very watered down version of higher education. So there are things to struggle against and be fearful of, but also there's power in knowledge, there's power in people's agency. And the more we can collectively respond to that, the better prepared we are. Knowing that we might be wrong, knowing that actually we might not succeed, but we owe it to the knowledge that we follow to speak up for it. You know, that's our job, whether we're successful or not. Our job in higher education, our job, you know, if you're an academic or if you're someone who wants to be an academic, part of that job is to speak up for knowledge and to follow it where it leads you. You know, even though that sometimes that's uncomfortable, but you know, a lot of the time it's, you know, what I do is an absolute privilege, and you have to, the whole point of privilege is, what are you going to do with it? You know, don't apologize for it. Don't pretend it's not there. What are you going to do with the privilege you've got in order to try and have an impact? You know, recognizing that you try, might fail, but that's the job.
But wonderful closing words. Thank you so much, everyone. We're already 1 minute over time. And thank you so much, Professor Paul Ashwin, for joining our Terra seminar today. There's one more seminar in the seminar series, which is Monday next week, the 20th of May, at from 5 till 6 p.m. Hong Kong time by Dr. Carrington on relational pedagogies. But for now, thank you so much for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thanks everyone for the really engaging discussion. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.